The smell hit me first, that thick, nauseating odor of crude oil seeping through the dirt. I stood at the edge of what used to be my beautiful backyard, watching federal agents in hazmat suits swarm my property like it was a crime scene. Because it was. Linda, my HOA president, stood 20 feet away with her hands cuffed behind her back. The same woman who had terrorized me for months with violation notices and threats was now facing federal charges. The excavator she had illegally brought onto my land sat silent, its bucket still dripping with oil from the pipeline it had just ruptured. 3 hours ago, Linda thought she owned me. She thought she could dig wherever she wanted, do whatever she pleased, because she had a title and a clipboard full of fake authority. But Linda made one fatal mistake. She had no idea what was buried beneath my property, and that mistake was about to cost her everything. 6 months earlier, I thought I had found paradise. 3 acres of rolling hills on the outskirts of town, far enough from the city noise but close enough to civilization. Ancient oak trees dotted the landscape like gentle giants, their branches creating natural canopies that filtered the sunlight into dancing patterns across the grass. The moment I walked this land, I knew it was home. The realtor led me through the property, pointing out the mature landscaping, the gentle slope that would be perfect for a garden, and the stunning view of the valley beyond. I could already picture myself sitting on the back porch at sunset, watching the world slow down after a long day. The house itself was modest but well-maintained, a cozy two-story with good bones and plenty of potential, but it was the land that sold me. 3 acres of freedom, space to breathe, room to grow. After years of cramped apartments and noisy neighbors, this felt like winning the lottery. Of course, there was an HOA. The realtor mentioned it almost as an afterthought, like it was barely worth discussing. She handed me a stack of papers with the covenant and restrictions, standard stuff about keeping the property maintained and respecting the community standards. I barely glanced at them. How much trouble could a small neighborhood association really be? The closing went smoothly. I signed what felt like hundreds of documents, including something about federal easements and utility rights. The title company explained that there was an old oil pipeline running somewhere beneath the property, installed decades ago when the area was still farmland. It did not seem important at the time. Just another piece of bureaucratic paperwork in a pile of bureaucratic paperwork. My first week in the house was blissful. I spent my days unpacking boxes and my evenings walking the property, planning where I would plant flower beds and maybe build a small workshop. The neighbors seemed friendly enough, waving from their yards and offering the occasional smile. Then Linda showed up. She arrived on a Tuesday morning with a plate of chocolate chip cookies and a smile that seemed too perfect to be real. Linda was probably in her mid-50s, with carefully styled blonde hair and the kind of outfit that looked expensive but practical. She introduced herself as the HOA president and welcomed me to the neighborhood. "I just wanted to stop by and make sure you have everything you need," she said, handing me the cookies. "We run a tight ship here, but I am sure you will fit right in." I thanked her for the cookies and invited her in for coffee. She declined politely, but took a moment to look around my front yard with what I would later recognize as a critical eye. "The previous owners were wonderful," she said. "They always kept everything in perfect condition. I am sure you will too." There was something in her tone that made me pause, but I brushed it off. She was just being neighborly, making sure the new guy understood the community standards. Nothing wrong with that. As Linda walked back to her car, she turned and smiled again. "Oh, and do not forget to review the HOA guidelines. We have our monthly meeting next Thursday if you would like to attend." I watched her drive away, a small knot of unease forming in my stomach, but I pushed the feeling aside. I had my dream property, my peaceful sanctuary, and surely a small HOA was not going to ruin that. Looking back, I realized that moment was the calm before the storm. Linda had already been studying my property, already forming her plans. She knew things about my land that I did not know. She knew about the pipeline beneath my feet, the federal easements in my deed, and the opportunities that came with 3 acres of prime real estate. But most importantly, she knew she could manipulate the system to get what she wanted, and what she wanted was my land. The first violation notice arrived exactly 2 weeks after Linda's visit. I found it tucked into my mailbox, a formal letter on official HOA letterhead. The subject line read, "Property maintenance violation, immediate attention required." I opened it with curiosity more than concern. Surely this was just a misunderstanding. According to the letter, my grass was in violation of community standards because it exceeded the maximum height of 2.5 inches. 2.5 inches. I walked outside and looked at my lawn. The grass was maybe 3 inches tall, healthy and green and perfectly normal by any reasonable standard. But the letter was not reasonable. It demanded that I cut the grass within 48 hours or face a $50 fine. It also included a detailed list of additional concerns that needed to be addressed. My mailbox was apparently the wrong shade of black, my garden hose was visible from the street, and my trash cans were not properly concealed. I called the number on the letter, expecting to have a friendly conversation and clear up the confusion. Linda answered on the second ring. "Oh, hello," she said, her voice suddenly cool and professional. "I was wondering when you would call." "Linda, I got your letter about the grass. I think there might be some mistake." "No mistake," she replied. "I measured it myself yesterday, 3 1/8 inches. That is clearly in violation." I felt my blood pressure rising. "You measured my grass." "It is my job to ensure community standards are maintained. Your property affects everyone's property values." We went back and forth for 10 minutes. Linda remained polite but firm, quoting HOA bylaws and community covenants like she was reading from a legal textbook. Finally, I gave up and agreed to cut the grass. But cutting the grass did not end it. The next week brought another letter, this time about the unauthorized bird feeder I had hung from my oak tree. The week after that, Linda cited me for leaving my garage door open during daylight hours. Each violation came with a fine. Each letter was more demanding than the last. I started to realize that I was not Linda's only target. Talking to other neighbors revealed a pattern of harassment that went back years. Mrs. Chen had been fined for planting flowers that were too colorful. The Johnsons had been cited for having a basketball hoop in their driveway. Everyone had stories, but everyone paid the fines and kept quiet. "It is easier to just comply," Mrs. Chen told me. "Fighting Linda is like fighting City Hall." But I was not ready to give up. I started researching property rights and HOA law, spending my evenings reading legal documents and trying to understand what Linda could and could not do. The more I learned, the more suspicious I became about her authority. Then came the letter that changed everything. It arrived on a Friday morning, thicker than the usual violation notices. The subject line read, "Community well installation, mandatory cooperation required." According to the letter, the HOA had decided to install a community well to improve property values and ensure adequate water supply for all residents. The chosen location was my backyard, specifically the area near my largest oak tree. The letter explained that the HOA had the authority to install community improvements on any property within the development, as outlined in the original covenant. It gave me 7 days to prepare for the installation and warned that any interference would result in legal action. I read the letter 3 times, my anger growing with each word. Linda was not just harassing me anymore. She was planning to tear up my property for some mysterious community project. That night, I pulled out my original property documents and read every word. The covenant was vague about community improvements, but it certainly did not give the HOA the right to dig up my backyard without my permission. I called Linda the next morning. "This is insane," I told her. "You cannot just decide to dig a well in my yard." "I can and I will," she replied. "The community voted and the decision has been made." "What community? You never held a meeting about this." "The board meeting was properly announced. If you chose not to attend, that is your problem." I hung up the phone, my hands shaking with rage. Linda was playing games with my property, my money, and my sanity. But I was about to learn that her games were much more dangerous than I had imagined. I woke up on Monday morning to the sound of diesel engines rumbling in my driveway. Through my bedroom window, I could see a convoy of trucks and construction equipment parked on my property. A large excavator sat near my oak tree, its engine idling ominously. I threw on clothes and ran outside, my heart pounding. Linda stood near the excavator, clipboard in hand, directing 2 men in hard hats. She looked up as I approached, her expression calm and controlled. "What the hell is this?" I demanded. "Good morning," she said pleasantly. "We are here to install the community well. I sent you a letter about this. You cannot just bring machinery onto my property without my permission." Linda smiled that cold, perfect smile. "Actually, I can. The HOA covenant gives us the right to make community improvements. You agreed to this when you bought the house." One of the contractors, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, stepped forward. "Sir, we are just doing our job. If you have a problem with the work order, you need to take it up with the lady." "I am taking it up with her," I said, turning back to Linda. "This is trespassing. I want you off my property right now." "That is not going to happen," Linda replied. "We have a schedule to keep." I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. Linda watched me with amusement as I explained the situation to the dispatcher. 20 minutes later, a police officer arrived. I felt a surge of relief, thinking that surely law enforcement would put an end to this madness. I was wrong. The officer, a young man who looked barely out of training, listened to both sides of the story. Linda presented him with a folder full of official-looking documents, including what appeared to be permits and legal authorizations. She spoke in calm, professional tones, explaining that this was a routine HOA project that had been properly approved. "I understand your concern, sir," the officer told me. "But if she has the proper permits and legal authority, there is not much I can do." "Those documents are fake," I protested. "She does not have the right to dig up my property." The officer looked uncomfortable. "That sounds like a civil matter. You might want to contact a lawyer." As the police car pulled away, Linda gave me a triumphant look. "Shall we get started?" she asked the contractors. The excavator roared to life. I stood helplessly as the massive machine began tearing up my beautiful backyard. The bucket bit into the earth near my oak tree, gouging out chunks of soil and grass with mechanical precision. "Stop," I shouted over the noise. "You cannot do this." Linda walked over to me, her voice barely audible above the engine noise. "I can do whatever I want. You should have read the fine print before you bought this house." I called every lawyer I could find, but it was Monday morning and most offices were not open yet. The few that answered told me the same thing. Civil property disputes take time to resolve, and there was no immediate way to stop the excavation. Meanwhile, the hole in my backyard grew deeper and wider. The contractors worked efficiently, following Linda's directions as they carved into my property. The beautiful oak tree that had been one of my favorite features was now surrounded by muddy earth and machinery. By noon, the excavator had dug down about 6 feet. The hole was roughly 10 feet wide and perfectly circular, like a giant well shaft. I watched from my back porch, feeling sick and helpless as strangers destroyed my sanctuary. That is when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, just a hint of something chemical and unpleasant. But as the excavator continued digging, the odor grew stronger. It reminded me of gasoline, but heavier and more nauseating. One of the contractors noticed it too. He stopped the machine and climbed down from the cab, sniffing the air with a puzzled expression. He walked to the edge of the hole and looked down, then turned to his partner with concern. "Hey, Mike, come smell this," he called out. Mike walked over and inhaled deeply. His face went pale. "That is petroleum," he said. "We need to stop digging." Linda marched over to them, her perfect composure finally showing cracks. "What are you talking about? Keep digging." "Lady, we are not digging anymore," Mike said firmly. "If there is oil or gas down there, we could cause a leak or an explosion." "That is ridiculous," Linda snapped. "There is no oil under this property." But I was already remembering the documents from my closing, the federal easement papers I had barely glanced at. The oil pipeline that ran beneath my property, installed decades ago when this was still farmland. The contractor was already packing up his equipment. "We are out of here," he told Linda. "This is not what we signed up for." As the contractors loaded their tools, the petroleum smell grew stronger. I could see a thin, oily sheen on the water that had collected at the bottom of the hole. My beautiful backyard was becoming a crime scene, and Linda was about to discover that she had made the biggest mistake of her life. The contractors had been gone for less than an hour when Linda made her fatal decision. Instead of stopping the project and investigating the petroleum smell, she called a different excavation company. A smaller, cheaper crew that was willing to finish the job without asking questions. I watched from my window as a single excavator returned to my property, operated by a man who looked like he had seen better days. Linda stood next to him, pointing angrily at the half-finished hole and demanding that he complete the work. "Just dig down another 4 feet," she told him. The other guys were being dramatic. The petroleum smell had grown stronger over the afternoon. Even from inside my house, I could smell the sickly sweet odor of crude oil. I had called the gas company, the city utilities department, and even the fire department, but everyone told me the same thing. Without an active leak or immediate danger, they could not intervene in a private property dispute. The new excavator operator did not seem concerned about the smell. He fired up his machine and resumed digging, biting deeper into the earth with each scoop. Linda watched with satisfaction as the hole grew deeper and wider. That is when it happened. The metallic clang echoed across my property like a gunshot. The excavator bucket had struck something hard and unforgiving deep in the earth. The operator stopped the machine and climbed down to investigate, but it was too late. The petroleum smell suddenly became overwhelming. Within minutes, crude oil began seeping up through the dirt at the bottom of the hole. The thin sheen I had noticed earlier became a dark, spreading pool of black liquid. I ran outside, my heart pounding. The excavator operator was backing away from the hole, his face pale with terror. Linda stood frozen, staring at the oil bubbling up from the earth like a nightmare come to life. "What did you do?" I screamed at her. I did not know," she stammered. "There was not supposed to be anything down there." The oil kept coming. What had started as a small seepage became a steady flow, filling the bottom of the hole and beginning to overflow onto my lawn. The smell was so strong now that I could taste it in the air. I called 911 again, but this time I was not calling about trespassing. "There is an oil leak on my property," I told the dispatcher. "A major leak. We need emergency response immediately." The next 30 minutes were chaos. Fire trucks arrived first, followed by hazmat teams and environmental specialists. Within an hour, my property was swarming with emergency responders in protective gear. The area around the hole was cordoned off with yellow tape, and my entire neighborhood was being evacuated. A federal agent approached me while I stood watching the disaster unfold. He was a stern-faced man in a suit that looked expensive and official. "Are you the property owner?" he asked. "Yes," I replied, "but I did not authorize this excavation." He made notes on a clipboard. "We are going to need to talk to you about what happened here, but first I need to ask, do you know what pipeline was damaged?" I felt my stomach drop. "Pipeline?" "This is a federal oil pipeline," he said. "It carries crude oil from the refineries in Texas to the distribution centers up north. It has been in operation for over 30 years. I looked back at Linda, who was now sitting in the back of a police car, her perfect composure completely shattered. The excavator operator was being questioned by another federal agent. "The woman who ordered the excavation," I said. "She claimed she had the authority to do this." The agent looked at Linda with disgust. "Ma'am, damaging a federal pipeline is a serious crime. She is looking at federal charges, environmental violations, and civil liability that could reach into the millions." As if to emphasize his point, more oil began spurting from the hole. The environmental team was working frantically to contain the leak, but crude oil was already soaking into my soil and threatening to reach the groundwater. A pipeline company executive arrived in a black SUV, followed by more federal agents and environmental specialists. My quiet neighborhood had become a federal disaster zone, and it was all because Linda thought she could dig wherever she wanted. The executive approached me with a grim expression. "Sir, I am sorry to inform you that your property will need to be evacuated immediately. We are dealing with a major environmental incident here." As I packed a bag and prepared to leave my dream home, I could not help but feel a sense of dark satisfaction. Linda had wanted to control my property, to bend me to her will with threats and harassment. Instead, she had destroyed herself and exposed her fraud to federal authorities. The oil kept flowing, and Linda's perfect little world was about to come crashing down. The federal investigation began immediately. By the next morning, my property had been transformed into a command center for environmental disaster response. FBI agents, EPA specialists, and pipeline company investigators swarmed the scene, documenting every detail of the illegal excavation. I found myself at the center of the investigation, not as a suspect but as a key witness. The agents were professional and thorough, asking detailed questions about Linda's harassment campaign, the unauthorized excavation, and the events leading up to the pipeline strike. "We need to understand the full scope of this incident," Agent Martinez told me during our first formal interview. "This is not just about property damage. Damaging federal infrastructure is a serious crime. I provided them with everything I had: the violation notices, the threatening letters, the documentation of Linda's harassment campaign. Each piece of evidence painted a picture of a woman who had been operating outside the law for years. The investigation revealed the shocking truth about Linda's authority. She had been running the HOA like her personal kingdom, making up rules and regulations that had no legal basis. The Community Well project was entirely fictional. There had been no board meeting, no community vote, no legal authorization for the excavation. She forged the permits, Agent Martinez explained to me. The documents she showed the police officer were complete fabrications. She had no more authority to dig on your property than any random person off the street. The environmental assessment was even more damning. The pipeline leak had contaminated over half an acre of soil with crude oil. The cleanup would take years and cost millions of dollars. The environmental impact extended far beyond my property, threatening local groundwater and requiring extensive remediation. Linda was arrested on federal charges that included damaging critical infrastructure, environmental violations, and fraud. The sight of her being led away in handcuffs provided a satisfaction I had not expected. For months, she had terrorized me with fake authority and empty threats. Now she was facing real consequences from real authorities. But the investigation was just beginning. As word spread through the neighborhood, other homeowners began coming forward with their own stories of Linda's abuse. The pattern that emerged was shocking in its scope and brazenness. Mrs. Chen revealed that Linda had been collecting illegal fines for years, keeping the money for herself instead of depositing it into HOA accounts. The Johnsons discovered that the community fund Linda had been demanding contributions to did not exist. Linda had been pocketing hundreds of dollars from each household. She has been running a fraud operation for at least 5 years, Agent Martinez told me. Your case just happened to be the one that exposed everything. The pipeline company launched its own investigation, hearing environmental specialists and legal experts to assess the full extent of the damage. They were remarkably professional about the situation, acknowledging that the leak was not my fault and that I was as much a victim as they were. We understand that you had no knowledge of the excavation, the company representative told me. Our legal team will be pursuing full damages from the responsible parties, not from you. Meanwhile, the cleanup operation continued around the clock. Environmental specialists worked to contain the oil leak and prevent further contamination. The damaged section of pipeline was shut down and repaired, but the environmental damage would take years to fully address. Linda's arrest made local and national news. The story of an HOA president causing a federal environmental disaster was too bizarre to ignore. I watched the news coverage with a mixture of vindication and amazement. The woman who had tried to control every aspect of my life was now facing federal prison time. The charges against Linda were serious and numerous. Damaging federal infrastructure carried a potential sentence of 20 years in prison. The environmental violations added additional penalties. The fraud charges related to her HOA activities could result in even more prison time. But the investigation revealed that Linda's crimes went beyond what anyone had imagined. She had been using her position as HOA president to intimidate and defraud homeowners for years. She had collected thousands of dollars in illegal fines, imposed fake rules and regulations, and threatened legal action she had no authority to take. She basically turned the HOA into a criminal enterprise, Agent Martinez explained. She was using fear and intimidation to extract money from homeowners who trusted her authority. The neighborhood was in shock. People who had been paying Linda's illegal fines for years suddenly realized they had been victims of a long-running fraud. The class action lawsuit against Linda began forming within days of her arrest. As the federal investigation continued, I found myself in the strange position of being both victim and star witness. The pipeline company assured me that they would handle all cleanup costs and that I would not be held liable for the environmental damage. But my dream property was now a federal disaster zone, and it would be months before I could return home. Linda had wanted to dig a well on my property. Instead, she had dug her own grave. The legal proceedings moved faster than I had expected. Within 3 months of the pipeline incident, Linda had been convicted on multiple federal charges. The judge showed no mercy, sentencing her to 15 years in federal prison and ordering her to pay millions in restitution to the pipeline company and affected homeowners. But the criminal conviction was only the beginning. The pipeline company's civil lawsuit against Linda was even more devastating. They sued her for the full cost of environmental cleanup, pipeline repairs, and business losses from the shutdown. The damages totaled over $12 million. Linda's defense attorney tried to argue that she had not intended to cause environmental damage, but the evidence was overwhelming. She had ignored the petroleum smell, dismissed the contractor's safety concerns, and forced the excavation to continue despite obvious warning signs. The defendant showed a reckless disregard for public safety and environmental protection, the judge stated during sentencing. Her actions resulted in one of the most expensive environmental disasters in the county's history. The pipeline company approached me separately about compensation. They acknowledged that I was an innocent victim who had suffered significant property damage and personal hardship as a result of Linda's actions. "We want to make this right," the company representative told me. "You did not ask for any of this, and you should not have to bear the financial burden of someone else's criminal behavior." Their settlement offer was generous beyond my expectations. They agreed to pay for all environmental cleanup on my property, fund complete landscaping restoration, and compensate me for the months I had been unable to live in my home. The total settlement was over $800,000. But the most surprising part of the settlement was the renegotiation of the pipeline easement. The original easement from decades ago had been paying the previous property owner a nominal annual fee. The pipeline company agreed to update the easement terms, providing me with substantial annual payments for the right to maintain their pipeline beneath my property. The new easement agreement would pay me over $50,000 per year for the next 30 years. What had started as Linda's attempt to destroy my property had inadvertently made me financially independent. Meanwhile, the class action lawsuit against Linda was gathering momentum. Over 40 homeowners joined the suit, claiming damages from years of illegal fines, harassment, and fraud. The legal team estimated that Linda had collected over $300,000 in illegal fees and fines over the past 5 years. "This is one of the most egregious cases of HOA abuse we have ever seen," the lead attorney told the local newspaper. "Linda turned a homeowner association into a personal extortion racket." The lawsuit also targeted the property management company that had been working with Linda. It turned out that they had been aware of her illegal activities, but had chosen to look the other way because she was generating revenue for their business. The dissolution of Linda's corrupt HOA was swift and decisive. The state attorney general's office launched an investigation into the organization's finances and governance. They discovered that Linda had been operating without proper board oversight, falsifying meeting minutes, and keeping fraudulent financial records. A new, properly managed HOA was established with real board members, transparent finances, and reasonable rules. The contrast with Linda's dictatorship was stark and immediate. The new board's first act was to rescind all of Linda's illegal fines and violations. The environmental cleanup on my property proceeded ahead of schedule. The pipeline company hired the best environmental specialists and landscaping contractors money could buy. They removed all contaminated soil, installed new drainage systems, and restored my property to better condition than it had been before the disaster. The new landscaping was spectacular. Professional designers created a garden paradise with native plants, mature trees, and a stunning water feature. The area where Linda had dug her illegal well was now a beautiful pond surrounded by flowering shrubs and ornamental grasses. When I finally moved back to my restored property, I barely recognized it. The environmental disaster had been transformed into an environmental showcase. My dream property had become even more beautiful than I had originally imagined. Linda, meanwhile, had lost everything. Her house was seized to pay the federal judgments against her. Her bank accounts were frozen. Her reputation was destroyed. The woman who had tried to control everyone else's property had lost her own property and her freedom. The final court judgment against Linda totaled over $14 million. She would spend the rest of her life in prison, and even if she lived to be 100, she would never be able to pay back what she owed. Justice had been served, and it was sweeter than I had ever imagined. 2 years after the pipeline incident, I received a letter from Linda. She had been allowed to write to me from federal prison, begging for mercy and asking me to support her appeal for early release. The letter was pathetic. Linda claimed that she had learned her lesson and that she was truly sorry for the damage she had caused. She asked me to consider the human cost of her long prison sentence and to remember that she had never intended to hurt anyone. I read the letter twice, then threw it in the trash. Linda had shown me no mercy during her reign of terror. She had harassed me, threatened me, and ultimately destroyed my property in pursuit of her own twisted agenda. The idea that she deserved mercy now, after being caught and convicted, was laughable. My property had been fully restored and was more beautiful than ever. The environmental cleanup had been completed years ahead of schedule, and the new landscaping was the envy of the neighborhood. The annual payments from the pipeline easement had allowed me to retire early and pursue my hobbies without financial worry. The new HOA was everything Linda's organization had not been: transparent, fair, and focused on actually serving the community. The board members were elected by the homeowners, the finances were audited annually, and the rules were reasonable and consistently applied. The neighborhood had been transformed by the experience. People who had lived in fear of Linda's arbitrary violations now worked together on community projects. The sense of paranoia and mistrust that had defined the area during Linda's reign had been replaced by genuine neighborly cooperation. Linda's house, seized by the federal government, had been sold at auction to a young family with children. They had no idea about the property's history, and I saw no reason to enlighten them. The past was behind us, and the neighborhood had moved on. I sometimes drove past the federal prison where Linda was serving her sentence, but I never stopped or tried to visit. She had chosen her path when she decided to abuse her authority and terrorize innocent homeowners. The consequences she was facing, were entirely of her own making. The pipeline company had learned valuable lessons from the incident as well. They had upgraded their monitoring systems, improved their communication with property owners, and implemented new safety protocols to prevent similar disasters. The executive who had handled my case told me that the incident had led to policy changes throughout the entire company. Looking back, I realized that Linda's attempt to control and destroy me had ultimately led to my greatest success. Her illegal excavation had exposed the valuable pipeline easement on my property, leading to financial independence I never could have imagined. Her criminal behavior had resulted in the creation of a fair and transparent HOA that actually served the community. Linda had set out to make my life miserable, but she had ended up making it wonderful. She had tried to bury me, but she had only buried herself. The woman who had wielded fake authority over everyone else was now subject to the very real authority of the federal prison system. Sometimes justice takes time, but when it finally arrives, it can be more satisfying than any revenge you could have planned yourself.